The kingdom of Valamir had not seen a duke like Lucian Dargovin in 3 generations. Not because he was cruel, though he was, not because he was brilliant, though that too, but because he had long ago made peace with the one truth that broke most men before they reached 30, that the world did not yield to those who asked. It yielded to those who made the cost of resistance unbearable. Every lord who had ever tested that theory now bent his knee in Thorncrown's great hall. Every one. And yet here, on the coldest night of the year, with the winter sovereign ball filling his castle with silk and candlelight, and the careful laughter of people who feared him, something had arrived that did not yet know what it was walking into. Watch what happens when an unmovable force finally meets the one thing it was never built to withstand. Stay until the end. You'll understand why. The snow had been falling since midday, and by the time the first carriages rolled through Thorncrown's iron gates, the courtyard lay buried under 8 inches of silence. Lucian Dargovin stood at the high window of the north tower and watched them arrive. He did not go down to greet his guests. He never did. The gesture would have implied obligation, and obligation implied equality, and equality was a fiction he had spent 12 years dismantling from every corner of Valamir's political architecture. Below him, torchlight turned the snow orange at the edges. Footmen moved in practiced patterns. Women in furs descended from carriages with the careful grace of people performing visibility. Lords straightened their coats and exchanged glances that said everything their mouths would not. Lucian read them all from 200 feet above. Lord Harwick's stiff spine, that meant he'd come with an agenda. Lady Caldermere's too wide smile, that meant she'd already been drinking. The Fenwick brothers moving in that practiced shoulder-to-shoulder formation they used when they felt outnumbered. He had built this night precisely. Not for pleasure. He had stopped believing in the pleasure of other people's company sometime around his 22nd year, when he'd discovered that what most men called fellowship was simply shared anxiety wearing a sociable face. He'd built this night because the Winter Sovereign Ball was the single occasion when every lord of consequence in Valamir's northern territories was obligated by tradition to appear beneath his roof, eat his food, drink his wine, and be reminded, through the sheer weight of Thorncrown's stone and the impeccable terror of his household, exactly where power resided. His steward, Aldrich, appeared at the tower door. 60 years old, thin as a blade, and possessed of the invaluable quality of never speaking unless spoken to. The guest count, Lucian said without turning. 214 confirmed attendees, Your Grace. Lord Fenwick Sr. sent regrets. His gout, apparently. His gout is politics. He'll hear about it tomorrow. Yes, Your Grace. The Vale delegation. A brief pause. Arrived 20 minutes ago. Lady Seraphina Vale and her uncle, Lord Edwin Vale. The lady requested no formal announcement. Lucian turned from the window then. Not sharply. He rarely did anything sharply, having learned long ago that sudden movements were a form of emotional leakage, but with a deliberateness that Aldrich recognized and straightened for. She requested, Yes, Your Grace. She was... Aldrich chose his next word with the care of a man walking on uncertain ice. Quite specific about it. And the footman complied. He was uncertain how to refuse, Your Grace. The lady was, Send him to the eastern barracks for the remainder of the season. Lucian moved past Aldrich toward the stairs. Uncertainty about how to refuse is precisely the kind of uncertainty that gets people killed in this castle. He descended through Thorncrown's interior with the unhurried pace of a man who understood that arrival was its own form of authority. The castle had been built 2 centuries ago by his ancestor, Dorian Dargovin, who had apparently believed that architecture could serve as psychological warning. The ceilings in the main corridors ran 30 feet high. The stone was black-veined granite that absorbed torchlight rather than reflecting it, which meant that Thorncrown's interior always existed in a quality of dimness that felt deliberate rather than deficient. The portraits along the grand staircase were all Dargovin men, all in armor or formal council dress, all with variations of the same expression, not cruelty exactly, but an absolute absence of apology. Lucian had grown up beneath those paintings. He'd stopped fearing them around age 9 and started studying them around age 12. By 16, he understood what they were actually teaching. Not pride, not lineage, but the specific grammar of a face that has decided never to explain itself. He paused on the landing above the great hall. Below him, 200-odd members of Valamir's aristocracy moved through the first hour of the evening. The orchestra occupied the eastern corner. 12 musicians playing the kind of formal winter compositions that nobody actually listened to, but that everybody required for the performance of civilized gathering. Servants moved with silver trays. Clusters of conversation formed and dissolved. The room smelled of expensive candles, pine from the decorative arrangements along the walls, and underneath it all, that specific human scent of people trying very hard to appear at ease. He found the veil woman in perhaps 4 seconds. She was standing near the west fireplace. Not the center of the room, not positioned for maximum visibility, not performing anything. She wore deep blue, almost navy, cut in the current Valamarian style, but with a simplicity that separated her from the ornamental excess around her. Dark hair, medium height. She was speaking to an older gentleman Lucian recognized as Lord Edwin Vale, her uncle, a harmless political creature who'd spent 30 years in careful neutrality. But she wasn't looking at her uncle. She was looking at the room the way a person looks when they're actually studying something rather than decorating themselves within it. He watched her for 90 seconds. She spoke twice, listened more, and at one point glanced toward the portrait of his grandfather above the fireplace with an expression that was not admiration and was not contempt, but was something more considered than either. He descended. The room did what it always did when he entered. A ripple of awareness moving outward from his position, conversations truncating, bodies shifting, faces assembling themselves into appropriate expressions of deference. He moved through it with the automatic ease of long practice, acknowledging enough to signal he had noticed, withholding enough to signal nothing was required of him. He accepted a glass of wine he had no intention of drinking and positioned himself at the edge of the room's geometric center. Aldrich materialized at his elbow. The man moved with preternatural quietness for someone his age. The council report you requested. Lord Fenwick's absence creates the alignment we discussed. Later. He kept his gaze moving across the room in the deliberate, patternless way that let people believe they weren't being watched. Tell me what you know about the Veil Woman. Aldrich understood, in the way of long service, that the question was not casual. Lady Seraphina Vale, 26 years of age. Only child of the late Lord Aldous Vale of Cressmere. Her father died 4 years ago under circumstances that were, a pause, disputed. The official determination was illness. There were other accounts. I've heard the official determination. What are the other accounts? That Lord Aldous was killed, that the circumstances were arranged to appear natural, that his daughter knew it and has spent the 4 years since attempting to demonstrate it. Aldrich kept his voice at the precise register of a man reporting weather. She has been largely unsuccessful in finding anyone willing to hear her. Cressmere was absorbed into Lord Brennan's holdings 18 months ago under a debt arrangement that several people found irregular. Lord Brennan is on the Crown Council. Yes, Your Grace. Lucian said nothing for a moment. She requested no announcement. Yes. She didn't want to be seen arriving. Or she didn't want someone specific to know she'd arrived until she chose. He looked at Aldrich then, a thing he did rarely, and which the older man understood as a form of acknowledgement. Keep the East Corridor watch doubled tonight, Lucian said, and find out what she came here carrying. He moved toward the fireplace. She heard him coming. He could tell because the particular quality of her stillness changed. Not flight stillness, not the freezing of a person caught doing something wrong, but the specific stillness of someone making a decision about how to present themselves in the next 5 seconds. He'd seen it in soldiers before battle and in diplomats before negotiation. He'd almost never seen it at a social function. Lord Edwin Vale saw him first and performed the expected response. A deep bow, a slight blanching, a reconstruction of expression into warm formality. Your Grace, what an extraordinary... That is, Thorncrown is magnificent as always. We are deeply honored. Lord Vale. He stopped the speech simply by not feeding it. His gaze moved to the woman. She turned to face him fully, and she looked directly at him. Not the eyes, down then up then away sequence that formed the universal grammar of encountering Lucian Dargovan. Not the careful management of expression that people used when they needed to demonstrate respect without showing fear. She simply looked at him. Dark eyes, level and direct, with the particular quality of someone who has already made their assessment and is now simply confirming it. He had not experienced this in... He searched and could not find a satisfying answer. Some years. Lady Vale, he said, Your Grace. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, not soft, precise. The voice of someone who'd learned to spend words carefully. Your castle is remarkable. The North Tower especially. I imagine the view of the courtyard from that height gives a person considerable advantage. The silence lasted 1.5 seconds, long enough to be intentional. It does, he said. Something moved through her expression. Not amusement exactly, more like the internal response to a piece of information being confirmed. She looked at him the same way she'd looked at his grandfather's portrait. Not admiringly, not with hostility, with the expression of someone reading a document. Lord Edwin had gone from blanching to a color somewhere between alabaster and resignation. My niece has that is, she speaks quite directly, Serafina said without looking away from Lucien. I speak directly, uncle. His Grace seems like a man who would find the alternative tedious. Lucien being found, to his own distant surprise, that he had nothing to say to that, not because it had struck him speechless. He was not a man who was struck speechless, but because everything available to say was a lesser response than silence. Your journey from Crestmere, he said after a moment, long in this weather. Crestmere is no longer mine. No trace of self-pity, stated as fact. We traveled from the Edwin estate at Far Hollow, 2 days. A pause. I was motivated. By the ball. By Thorncrown. Her eyes held his without fluctuation. I've heard it's the one place in Valamir's north where certain conversations are possible, where a person might reach ears that, given appropriate reason, might choose to hear them. My ears are very selective, Lucien said. I know. She had not looked away from him once. I've been studying their selection criteria for some time. Lord Edwin looked as though he was trying to calculate the exact distance to the nearest door. Lucien looked at this woman, at the way she stood, at the precise economy of her, at the quality of nerve that let someone look him in the face and speak to him like an equal at his own event, and felt something move in the architecture of his interior that he had believed long since sealed. Lord Vale, he said, still looking at Serafina. I believe the Harwick family is near the east window. Lord Harwick's son has a proposal regarding the Marin waterway rights that you've been involved in. You should hear it from him directly. Edwin Vale understood a dismissal when it arrived wearing the clothing of a suggestion. Of course, Your Grace. Yes, absolutely. He was gone in perhaps 11 seconds. Serafina watched her uncle depart with an expression that held the faintest edge of something. Not abandonment, not surprise. Recognition, maybe. The expression of someone who has been left to manage things alone often enough that it no longer registers as exceptional. That was kind, she said, without any particular inflection to indicate whether she meant it. It wasn't kind. I wanted him gone. Lucien moved beside her, facing the fire, which gave them both the option of looking at it rather than each other, a configuration he had used in 100 tactical conversations. What are you carrying? The pause was very brief. I carry quite a lot of things, Your Grace. You'll need to narrow that. You arrived without announcement. You positioned yourself at the fireplace, a good wall to your back, full view of the room's entry points, clear line to the servants' corridor exit. You spent the first 20 minutes assessing rather than performing. You came here with a specific objective and a specific person in mind to receive it. He looked at the fire. I'm asking what you're carrying. She was quiet for a moment that felt different from her earlier silences. Longer, more interior. Documents, she said finally. Evidence. A very specific reconstruction of events surrounding my father's death and the subsequent transfer of Crestmere's assets, including certain Crown Council members whose involvement in those events would be professionally catastrophic for them. She paused. You asked me what I was carrying. That is what I'm carrying. I'm also carrying 4 years of being told that what I know isn't provable, which has given me a very thorough understanding of what the word provable actually means when powerful men use it. Lucien was quiet for several seconds. Who else knows you brought these documents here tonight? No one who matters. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have. She turned slightly toward him, still not performing anything, still with that quality of simply existing in her assessment of him. You're wondering whether I'm dangerous to be seen with, whether what I've brought into your castle is a liability or an asset, Whether I came here because I trust you or because I'm desperate enough to treat trust as a luxury I can no longer afford. A beat. The answer is the third one. I have no illusions about your character, Your Grace. I came here because you're the only person in Valamir's North with both the power to act on this and no existing reason to protect the men implicated in it. You've done considerable research. I've done nothing else for 4 years. He looked at her then. She looked back. The fire moved between them, and neither of them paid it any attention. Lord Brennan, he said, is he one of the names? He's the central one. And the others? 2 additional council members, one name that will surprise you and one that won't. A pause. The one that won't is Lord Harwick. Lucian felt something shift in the back of his mind. Not surprise, no. He had suspected Harwick for 18 months, but confirmation had always remained out of reach. The specific physical weight of a suspicion becoming a fact. And the one that will surprise me. I'd rather show you the documents first. Some things are better established in writing before they're spoken aloud. He studied her for 3 long seconds. You're not afraid of me. I'm absolutely afraid of you. She said it with the same directness she'd used for everything else. You built that fear deliberately, and you're very good at it. But I've been afraid of other things for long enough that your particular version of it has become, she considered the word, contextual. Contextual. Meaning I can hold it and still function. He was quiet for a moment. The orchestra had moved into a slower composition. Around them, the room continued its elaborate performance of sociability, and the 2 of them stood at the fireplace as though existing in a slightly different version of the evening than everyone else. The documents, he said. Where are they? Safe. That's not... I know it's not an answer. It's the arrangement I'm offering. You agree to hear me, formally, privately, with witnesses of my choosing present, and I show you what I have. You decide after that. Her chin was level. Her voice was completely steady. I'm not handing the only leverage I possess to a man I've known for 8 minutes based on a reputation for ruthlessness, however well earned. Even desperate women have operational logic. Lucien d'Argovin looked at this woman, this 26-year-old with her dead father and her stolen estate and her 4 years of careful, furious documentation, and felt something happen in the sealed architecture of himself that he had no name for immediately. He was saved from having to identify it by Aldrich, who appeared at his left shoulder with the particular quality of urgency that meant something had gone wrong. Your Grace, the voice was barely above breath. A word. Lucien held Serafina's gaze for one more moment. We'll continue this conversation. I'll be here, she said, as though she had no doubt he would return. He stepped away with Aldrich, moving toward the corridor archway with the unhurried pace that discouraged observation. What? He said when they were beyond earshot. The Veil woman's coach, Aldrich said quietly. One of our men in the courtyard found it unlocked. The compartment beneath the rear seat. He paused. Empty, Your Grace. Whatever she was transporting, she didn't bring it in the coach. She carried it on her person or had it delivered separately. That would be my assessment, yes. Another pause. There's something else. Lord Harwick sent a servant to his coat room 30 minutes ago. The servant returned with something and immediately sought out Lord Harwick in the east alcove. They've been in private conversation since. Lucien processed this in the span of 3 seconds. Harwick had received information. The timing aligned with the Veil woman's arrival, with the 20 minutes she'd spent assessing the room rather than announcing herself. 20 minutes was long enough for someone watching the courtyard to send a message. The east alcove, he said. Yes, Your Grace. How many people currently between the main hall and that alcove? Perhaps 40, along that corridor. Lucien turned and looked back at the fireplace. At Serafina Veil, who had not moved and was now standing alone with her back to the wall in exactly the position she'd chosen, watching the room with that quiet, reading expression. Who had told him, 8 minutes into their acquaintance, that she was carrying evidence capable of destroying men on the Crown Council. Who had arrived tonight without announcing herself. Who had not brought her documents in her coach, and who was now the only person in this room who did not yet know that Lord Harwick, a man implicated in her father's death, a man who had every reason to ensure she never spoke, had just received a message and retreated to a private alcove. Lucien moved back through the crowd with a speed that was technically still unhurried but covered ground considerably faster than before. He was at the fireplace in 40 seconds. Serafina turned to look at him, She read something in his face. Not fear, because it wasn't fear. It was the cold and clarifying arrival of operational necessity. And he watched her expression shift from controlled assessment into something sharper. "Harwick knows you're here," he said quietly. The color in her face did not change. Only her eyes did, very slightly, with the specific adjustment of someone who has been running threat calculations long enough that new inputs simply get routed into the existing structure rather than dismantling it. "How long ago?" 20 minutes at minimum. He's in private conversation now." A pause. "The documents. Where are they?" She held his gaze for 2 seconds that felt considerably longer. "With someone I trust," she said. "In this building." His jaw tightened. The only visible evidence of what passed through him. "You brought an accomplice into my castle without my knowledge." "I brought a witness," she said. "Those are different things, and yes." "Who?" "Someone who arrived this evening and who has been waiting in a specific location for a signal from me." She looked at him steadily. "A location that, if Harwick's people begin searching this castle tonight, they will find." The weight of it settled between them. Not panic. Neither of them were prone to panic, but the specific gravity of a situation that had just accelerated past its planned parameters into territory where the next 30 seconds would determine what the next 30 years looked like. "What's the signal?" Lucian said. Her eyes didn't leave his face. For the first time since he'd met her, he saw something in them that was not calculation, not assessment, not the controlled distance of someone managing exposure. Something more direct than that. The expression of a person who has run out of options that don't require trusting someone they're not sure they should trust. "You," she said. "The signal is you." And then every candle in the great hall went out at once. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. Not long enough to be an accident, long enough to be a message. Lucian moved on instinct. His hand found Serafina's arm in the black, not grasping, just locating, the way a man orients himself by the one fixed point in an unfamiliar room. He felt her go still at the contact rather than pull away, which told him she was running the same calculation he was, that the darkness was tactical, that someone had paid a servant, or threatened one, and that the 4 seconds of cover had been purchased for a specific purpose. The candles came back, not all at once but in waves, servants moving through the hall with tapers, the orchestra stopping and then uncertainly resuming, the crowd producing that specific murmur of a gathering that wants to believe nothing has happened. Lucian's hand dropped from her arm. He turned to face the room with the particular blankness that his face adopted under operational pressure. Not calm, something colder than calm. The expression of a man who has decided that whatever comes next, he will be the one deciding its shape. "The corridor behind the east fireplace," he said quietly, without looking at her. "There's a servant's passage. 3rd panel from the left releases inward. Follow it north 30 feet and you reach the map room. Lock it from inside." "And the person I came with?" "Name." A pause. "Mira. A woman. She's in the linen storage on the 2nd floor, east wing, 3rd door past the landing." He processed this without visible reaction. Someone had moved through his castle's interior tonight, had been placed there, had been waiting, and he had not known. The failure of intelligence was a cold, specific thing that he filed away to address later. "My man will find her," he said. "Go." Serafina looked at him for 1 second with those dark, reading eyes. Then she moved, not hurrying, not running, the practiced walk of a woman crossing a room for unremarkable reasons, toward the fireplace and the panel that Lucian had described. He watched until she reached it, watched the panel give, watched the darkness take her. Then he turned and found Aldrich. "The east alcove," he said. "Now." 1. Lord Harwick was a large man who had spent his 60 years constructing the specific architecture of someone untouchable. He had the face of someone who had never been seriously challenged, not ugly, not stupid, but assembled with the comfortable certainty of a man who had confused safety with immunity. He was still in the east alcove when Lucian arrived, and the servant who had brought him the earlier message stood nearby with the expression of someone reconsidering all of his recent choices. Harwick turned, and there it was. The thing that Lucian had learned to read over 12 years, that involuntary sequence in the face of a person confronted before they're ready. The brief widening, the micro-recalibration, the assembly of an expression meant to replace the one that had just been there. "Dargovan." He recovered quickly. They always did, the ones with practice. Extraordinary business, the candles. Yes. Lucian stopped 6 feet away, which was closer than social convention required. You had a message delivered tonight. Not a question. Hark absorbed this. I receive messages regularly. I'm on the Crown Council. The message arrived 20 minutes ago. You've been here since. Lucian let his gaze rest on the servant, who made a very small movement backward. Who sent it? I'm not certain I understand why the nature of my private correspondence. Lord Harwick! Lucian's voice did not rise. It never rose. It simply acquired a quality of compression, as though the words were being held at a pressure slightly above what was comfortable to receive. I'm going to ask you once more, in this room, without witnesses. After that, the conversation moved somewhere with very different acoustics. Harwick's jaw tightened. The man knew leverage when he felt it. He'd used it himself for decades. Being on the receiving end had the specific effect of making people simultaneously furious and calculating. A contact, Harwick said finally. Someone watching arrivals, the Veil woman. He caught himself, but not fast enough. Go on. She shouldn't be here. The mask slipped by degrees. Beneath it was something that wasn't quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood. Her presence at this event is, there are people with interests in her not reaching certain ears. I was informed as a courtesy. As a courtesy? Lucien let those 3 words sit in the air between them for a moment. You received a courtesy notification about a 26-year-old woman arriving at my ball, in my castle, during an event under my roof. He paused. Who believed that was appropriate? The interests I mentioned are, I heard what you said. I'm asking who. Harwick looked at him then with the expression of a man doing arithmetic about his own survival. Brennan, he said. Quieter now. Lord Brennan's man. He knew she'd been moving toward the Northern Territories. He wanted to know if she made contact with anyone significant. And what were you meant to do with that information? The silence lasted long enough that it became its own answer. Lucien looked at Harwick with a clarity that had nothing emotional in it. The man had spent 30 years in the comfort of other men's protection, moving through Valamir's political structure like a passenger rather than an architect. The evidence in Serafina Vale's possession, evidence her father had apparently died for, evidence that had kept her alive in the particular way that dangerous knowledge keeps a person alive, making them valuable enough to let breathe, would not remain evidence if she didn't breathe long enough to present it. You're going to tell me everything Brennan's man said, Lucien said. And then you're going to spend the remainder of this evening in the dining hall being visibly sociable. If you leave this castle before the ball ends, I will interpret that as an answer to a question I haven't asked yet. And my interpretations, Lord Harwick, have consequences. Harwick's mouth opened and closed. Then he talked. The map room was cold. Thorncrown's interior heat did not reach this far into the north wing efficiently, and the room had the particular chill of spaces that existed functionally rather than comfortably. A long table, rolled charts along the walls, a single oil lamp that Serafina had lit from a tinderbox on the shelf. She stood at the table with her arms crossed over her chest, not from cold, but from the specific posture of someone waiting and refusing to let the waiting show. She heard the door before it opened, a precise sequence of knocks, 3, pause, 2, that told her this was Lucien's man rather than anyone else. The man who entered was perhaps 40, compact, with the economical movement of someone trained for indoor work in the specific sense that Thorncrown's security required. He introduced himself as Garrett, said nothing else, and placed a small leather case on the table. Mira is safe, he said. She's been moved to the west guest room, 2nd floor. No one knows she's there except His Grace and myself. Serafina let out a breath that she had been holding, she realized, since the candles went out. She has documents. She does now. He nodded at the case. She asked me to bring these to you directly. Serafina opened the case with hands that were steady. 4 years had given her a very thorough education in keeping her hands steady. Inside were papers she had seen so many times, she could have reproduced them from memory, but seeing them still produced the same sensation in her chest. Not triumph, not relief, but the cold, awful weight of being right about something you had desperately wanted to be wrong about. The door opened again. Lucien entered with the quality of a man who had just finished one problem and arrived at the next without transitional sentiment. He looked at the documents on the table. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. That specific shift of a person encountering confirmation. Garrett left without being asked. The silence in the room was different from the silence in the Great Hall. There, silence had been tactical, a thing they'd used against each other. Here it was simply the absence of anything that needed to be said yet. "Harwick," Lucian said. "He was given a notification by Brennan's people. He was meant to confirm your presence and your contact." He moved to the table, looked at the documents without touching them. "What exactly is in these?" "Letters. Correspondence between Brennan and two men I can name who managed the debt arrangement on Crestmere. The arrangement was constructed specifically to acquire the property. It was never about debt recovery. My father discovered the reason Brennan wanted Crestmere specifically, which is that there are mineral rights in the Eastern Valley that the Crown Council has been concealing from the general nobility for 11 years. She paused. He tried to expose it. They made it look like illness. Lucian was quiet for a moment. The mineral rights are worth, at current market assessment, somewhere between 12 and 15 million sovereign marks annually. The number settled in the room. Lucian looked at the documents, then at her. "You've been carrying this for 4 years, he said. "Carrying it and watching every door close. Not bitterness exactly. Something harder than bitterness. Something that had been through bitterness and come out the other side with its edges filed down to pure function. Every lord I approached either had existing relationships with Brennan or decided the risk wasn't worth the association. Some of them were genuinely frightened. Some of them were already paid." A pause. "You were the last calculation." "The last. The only one left who has both the standing to act on this and a reason to want Brennan's position on the council weakened." She met his gaze. "I know why you'd want that. I know what the Eastern mineral rights would mean to Thorncrown's economic position if the concealment were exposed and the rights redistributed. I am not asking you to do this for principle. I am asking you to do it because it serves you." Something moved through Lucien's expression that wasn't quite what she'd expected. Not calculation. She'd anticipated calculation. Something less comfortable than that. "You researched my motivations. I researched everything. And you believe that's the better pitch. Not justice. Not your father. The economic argument." Her chin stayed level. "I believe you're a man who survives by being honest about what things actually cost and what they actually gain. Dressing this in sentiment would insult both of us." He held her gaze for 3 seconds that had a specific weight to them. "Your father," he said. "Tell me about him." The question landed differently than anything else he'd said. She absorbed it. Aldous Vale had been a careful man, a scholar more than a politician, someone who had believed that correct information presented to the right authority would produce correct outcomes. He had been wrong about that in the most permanent way available. "He was thorough," she said. "He documented everything. He believed documentation was protection." A pause. "It wasn't." "No. But it became mine." Lucian looked at her. There was something in his face that she had not seen there before, that did not fit the architecture she'd spent 4 years studying from a distance. She catalogued it without naming it, because naming it felt premature, and she had not survived this long by moving prematurely. "The documents stay here tonight," he said. "In this room. Garrett will stand outside." He picked up the first letter, read it with the speed of someone accustomed to processing information quickly. Then the second. Then he set them down and looked at the wall for a moment with the expression of a man absorbing the specific dimensions of a problem. "Brennan has 3 votes on the council," he said. "Harwick is one. The second is Lord Caverley. He's not here tonight, which tells me he may already know you're in Valamir. The third is Lord Edris, yes." He looked at her. "You know all of it. I told you. 4 years. Edris is the one you said would surprise me." His public position on the council's accountability reforms made him appear to be Brennan's opposition. He's not. A pause. He's the architecture. Brennan is the implementation. Lucien was very still for a moment. Lord Idris was... The implications arranged themselves in his mind with the cold precision of a military map. Idris sat on 3 separate oversight bodies. His apparent opposition to Brennan had made him the man that reformers trusted, that concerned lords sought out, that information flowed toward in the belief that it would be used against the corruption rather than to protect it. Every piece of intelligence that had reached Idris over the past decade about Brennan's operations had gone directly back to Brennan. That's how your father was found out, Lucian said. He'd reached out to Edris. Her voice did not change. Yes. The silence in the room had a different texture now. You came here with this, Lucian said slowly, knowing that Brennan's network had already identified you as a threat, knowing that Harwick was here tonight, and that someone might send notification, knowing that the documents, if found on your person. He stopped. You understood what you were walking into. I walked in anyway. She held his gaze. What choice geometrically remained to me? He looked at her for a long moment. The oil lamp between them threw shadows at angles that shifted when the cold draft moved through the room's northern gap. Outside, very faintly, the orchestra had resumed in the great hall. The ball continued, 200 people drinking his wine and believing the evening was progressing normally. Lucien picked up the documents and held them. Then he did something that Serafina had not anticipated in any of her 4 years of calculation. He crossed to the fireplace in the corner of the map room, small, functional, burning low, and held the documents above the flames. Her entire body went rigid. What are you... If Brennan's people search this castle tonight, he said, without looking at her, and they find these documents in your possession, you are dead before morning. If they find them in this room, the story becomes that you were a woman who fabricated evidence and fled when exposed. His eyes came up to hers. If they find nothing, those are the only copies. I know. His voice was very level. I memorized them, all 4 pages. It took me 40 seconds. A pause. I have an exceptional memory for things that are useful to me. She stared at him. The documents, her father's 4 years of work, her own 4 years of careful preservation, hovered above the fire. I have your testimony, he said. I have Harwick, who will now talk at length about Brennan's communications rather than face what refusing me would cost him. I have 3 names, 2 connecting financial records that Aldrich will obtain through other means by morning, and the specific knowledge of what Edris has been doing for a decade. He looked at her. The documents were your protection. They are now your liability. And I do not need paper to move against Brennan. I need leverage, and leverage I have. Serafina looked at the fire, at the documents above it, at the face of Lucien Dargoven, which held an absolute pressurized steadiness that she had no established framework for interpreting. You'd destroy the only physical evidence in this entire situation, she said slowly, based on your own memory and a plan you formulated in the last 4 minutes. Yes. And I'm supposed to trust that? No. The word was direct. You're supposed to recognize that you're out of better options and that the man standing in front of you has just made himself complicit in a conspiracy against 3 Crown Council members, which means his survival is now structurally tied to yours. His eyes held hers with the specific pressure of complete seriousness. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to understand the geometry. She looked at the documents for one long, terrible second. Do it, she said. The papers caught. 4 years of her father's handwriting turned to ash in the time it took to breathe. Neither of them looked away from the fire until it was finished. Then Lucien turned from the fireplace and looked at her with that expression she still hadn't named. You'll stay in the North Wing tonight, he said. Not the guest quarters. The North Wing. My corridor. Her eyes came up sharp. Not for the reason your expression suggests, he said, with something that was almost dry. Because Harwick's people, if Brennan has given instructions, will search the guest wings first. The North Wing is mine. No one enters it without my explicit direction. A pause. You'll be safe there. And Mira will remain where she is. Garrett will stay with her. Serafina looked at him for a long moment, at the castle around them that she'd studied for 4 years as though it were a document to be decoded, at the man she had built a careful clinical understanding of from a distance, which had now turned out to be an understanding of the outline with no knowledge of the interior. You burned the documents, she said. Not accusation, more like confirmation of a fact she was still processing. Yes, to protect me. A pause that held something complicated in it. To eliminate a liability. She held his gaze. Those are different explanations. They are, he said, and did not offer a third one. Outside in the corridor, Garrett's footsteps moved, a pattern, steady, professional. The great hall's music reached them thin and remote. The ash in the fireplace cooled. Serafina became aware, in the particular way that the body registers things the mind has been too occupied to process, that she was alone in a locked room with a man who had just bound his own fate to hers without being asked to, who had made a calculation she hadn't predicted in 4 years of calculating him, whose face, in the low lamplight, held something she recognized from her own reflection on the worst nights of the last 4 years, the specific expression of a person confronting the first thing in a long time that they cannot fully control. She understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had survived by reading rooms accurately, that something had shifted in this one, and that neither of them, when they left it, would be returning to the versions of themselves that had entered. They left the map room at separate times. Lucien went first, back into the current of the ball, moving through the thinning crowd with the same unhurried authority he'd carried in. 2 hours had passed. The evening was settling into its later register, the conversations looser, the wine more evident in the way people held themselves, the orchestra playing slower compositions that nobody danced to. He spoke to 4 lords in 40 minutes, said nothing of substance to any of them, and watched the east alcove from across the room until he confirmed that Harwick had done as instructed and was visibly, pointedly, performing sociability near the Caldermere family. Serafina arrived in the great hall 12 minutes after him. She had fixed whatever the tension of the map room had done to her composure. She moved through the room the same way she'd arrived. No announcement, no performance. She accepted a glass of wine she didn't drink and stationed herself near the south wall with her back covered. From 40 feet away, Lucien watched her eyes work the room and felt something that he identified clinically and without satisfaction as the specific discomfort of admiring a quality in someone else that you have spent your entire life believing was exclusively your own. The ball ended at midnight. Harwick left in his carriage without meeting Lucier's satisfaction's eyes. The Fenwick family departed with the particular speed of people who had decided the evening held no further opportunity. Lord Edwin Vale found his niece near the entrance hall and touched her elbow with the expression of a man who had spent 3 hours trying not to know what he suspected, and Serafina said something to him quietly that made him nod and let go. Lucien watched her watch her uncle's carriage leave. Then she turned and found him looking at her from across the entrance hall, and neither of them moved for a moment, and the last of the footmen and servants moved around them like water around 2 fixed stones. "The north wing," he said. "Yes," she said. The room he gave her was 3 doors from his own. It was not a guest room in the decorative sense, no ornamental excess, no performance of hospitality. It was simply a room that was solid and clean and defensible, with one window that faced the interior courtyard rather than the outer walls, and a door with a lock that worked from the inside. He showed her the lock himself, which she noted without comment. Mira was brought from the west guest room an hour later. She was younger than Lucien had expected, perhaps 22, with the careful stillness of someone who had learned, probably young, that stillness was safer than visibility. She and Serafina spoke in low voices in the corridor for several minutes, while Garrett stood at the stairwell. Lucien remained in his own room with the door open 3 inches, not from propriety, but because the north wing's acoustics let him hear the corridor clearly, and he was not yet finished processing the geometry of the night. He sat at his desk and wrote 4 letters. The first to his financial steward regarding the Crestmere mineral records. The second to a man in the capital named Severn, who moved in the specific circles where information was bought and sold without formality. The third to Lord Caverley, a careful, ambiguous letter, the kind that meant nothing if read innocuously, and everything if read by someone who knew the context, which Caverley would, and which would tell Lucien something about Caverley's position by how he responded. The 4th letter he started and didn't finish, and then burned. He was on his second read of Severn's last communication when he heard the corridor go quiet in a way that was different from simple silence. He was at the door in 4 seconds. The corridor was empty. Garrett's post at the stairwell was empty. The door to Serafina's room was closed, but the gap at the bottom showed no lamplight. Lucien's mind ran this calculation in the span of a breath. Not panic, nothing like panic, but the cold and total redirect of attention that happens when a trained instinct fires. Garrett did not leave his post. That was a structural fact, not a preference. If Garrett was gone, something had removed him. He moved down the corridor. He found Garrett on the back stairwell, alive, breathing, A cut on his temple that had bled considerably and stopped, the specific slackness of someone who had been struck with something heavy and would wake with a headache and a furious embarrassment. Lucian checked the pulse, confirmed the breathing, and felt a cold in his chest that was not fear but was its closest neighboring emotion. Then he heard the voices from the floor below. He went down the servants' stairs with the speed of someone who has stopped performing unhurriedness. The lower corridor, East Branch, connected the north wing to the castle's secondary entrance, a service door used by tradesmen and on certain historical occasions by people who wanted to move through Thorncrown without appearing on the main record of arrivals. It opened to a covered passage that led to the east courtyard. He heard Seraphina's voice first, controlled, but with a compression in it that he recognized as controlled fear, which was different from unafraid, which was what she'd been in the Great Hall. Something had changed the equation. Then another voice, male, low, with a specific quality of authority that comes not from rank but from being the person in the room currently holding the advantage. Lucian reached the corridor junction and stopped. 3 men, one holding a lamp, one positioned at the service door, one standing 6 feet from Seraphina with the particular posture of someone who has already decided how the next 10 minutes resolve and is simply managing the logistics. Seraphina stood against the stone wall. Mira was not there, which meant either she'd been separated already or had not been found. The man near Seraphina was not wearing livery. He was wearing the kind of clothing that was designed to look like nothing, dark, nondescript, the clothing of professional absence. He had a knife at his belt that he had not drawn, which was almost more threatening than if he had, because it meant he was confident he didn't need it yet. "Lord Brennan's regards," the man was saying. "He wants the documents, all of them, and your word that you leave Valamir's northern territories before morning." "I don't have the documents," Seraphina said. "Lady Vale." Patient, the specific patience of someone on a schedule. "We've looked. We haven't found them. That means you have them or you've passed them to someone. Either way, you're going to tell us which." "I burned them," she said. A pause. "That's not an answer we can accept. It's the only honest one I have." Her voice was absolutely level. Lucian recognized the phrase. She'd used it with him in the Great Hall 8 hours and an entire geography ago when she'd been a stranger he was reading from across a fireplace. He stepped into the corridor. All 3 men registered him at the same instant. The one at the door reached for something at his belt. The one with the lamp went still. The one near Seraphina turned with the careful movement of a professional recalculating. Lucian did not reach for anything. He had not brought a weapon to his own ball. He stood in the corridor in his formal dress with the expression of a man who has found something in his house that requires removal. And the specific quality of his stillness, the absolute lack of alarm in it, the way it occupied the corridor, as though the 3 intruders were the anomaly and he was the architecture, did more than a weapon would have. "You're in my castle," he said. The lead man held his position near Seraphina, professional enough not to break and run, experienced enough to recognize a recalculation point. "Your Grace, this is a private matter between Lord Brennan and—" "There is no private matter in Thorncrown," Lucian said. "There are only matters I know about and matters I'm about to know about. You've confused this room for the latter category." A pause. "Who sent you?" "I've told you." "Brennan." "Yes. I heard you." He moved forward 3 steps, and the man at the door made a decision and ran. Out through the service entrance into the east courtyard, footsteps disappearing into the cold. The man with the lamp looked at the lead man, then at Lucian, and followed. Apparently the math had clarified. The lead man stayed. He was good at his job, whoever he was. He looked at Lucien with the expression of someone recalculating rather than breaking. Lord Brennan will want to know that his men failed to retrieve documents that no longer exist, that the woman they were sent to coerce is under my specific protection, and that I now have names, faces, and a very complete understanding of his operational methods. Lucian stopped 4 feet away. "Tell him I said so." Those exact words. The man left. Not running, walking, which was its own kind of answer about who he was. The corridor emptied. Seraphina let out a breath. It was the first physiological response he had seen from her that she hadn't managed. Brief, involuntary, the body releasing something the mind had been holding rigid. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for 1 second, and then dropped it. Mira, she said. If she stayed in her room, she's fine. Garrett will find her when he wakes up. Lucian looked at Serafina. In the low corridor light, she looked. Not diminished, nothing like diminished, but stripped of one layer of the careful surface, the way a person looks at 3 in the morning when the performance of the day has finally run its cost. How did they get in? I don't know. Someone let them in. The service entrance has a key lock and a bar. Someone removed the bar from inside. He held her gaze. Who in this castle knew you were here tonight? Aldrich, Garrett, you. A pause. And whoever you told. He said nothing. You didn't tell anyone else, she said. It was not entirely a question. No. She looked at him for a moment with that expression that was not quite trust and not quite its absence. Something more provisional than either, something that had been recalibrated by the last hour. Then someone saw, or followed, or... She stopped. Lucien was already moving back toward the stairwell. He found Aldrich in the steward's room off the main corridor, which was where Aldrich spent the late hours of any major event, accounting and closing down the evening's logistics. The man was at his desk with the lamp burning and his coat still on, which meant he hadn't been to sleep and hadn't intended to. Lucien closed the door. Aldrich looked up, read the room with 60 years of practice, set down his pen. The service entrance, Lucien said. East wing, the interior bar. Aldrich's face did something complicated. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something more painful than guilt, which was the expression of a man who has already lived with a decision and is now simply watching it arrive. Your Grace. Who? The silence lasted 4 seconds. I received communication this afternoon, Aldrich said, before the ball, from Lord Cassian. The name landed in the room like a change in temperature. Cassian Dargovan, Lucian's younger brother, who had spent the last 3 years in the Southern Territories managing the Dargovan trade interests with apparent competence and a carefully maintained distance from Thorncrown's politics, who sent correspondence twice monthly, always measured, always appropriate, who had never in Lucien's structural understanding of their relationship been a variable. Cassian, Lucien said, he asked me to facilitate access for 3 men tonight. He said they were his contacts, that they needed to retrieve something from a guest room without disturbing the event. He said it was a family matter. Aldrich's voice was steady in the way of someone who has already passed through the worst of it internally. He said you were aware. I was not aware. I know that now. No. Lucien stood in the center of the room and felt something move through the architecture of himself that he had no prepared response for. Not rage. Rage was an emotion that implied surprise, and surprise was an emotion that implied the world had violated an expectation he'd been foolish enough to hold. What he felt was something that had no clean name, the cold, structural collapse of a certainty he had not known he was resting his weight on until the ground gave way beneath it. Cassian had known about Serafina, had known she was coming to Thorncrown, had known what she was carrying, or suspected it, had positioned 3 men, Brennan's men, or men that served both Brennan and Cassian, which was a distinction that now required investigation, to retrieve her documents and, if the lead man's patience had run out, to do whatever came after that. His brother had used his own steward, had used Aldrich's 60 years of loyalty to Thorncrown as a tool for the opposite of everything that loyalty had served. Why didn't you confirm with me directly? Lucien said. Aldrich met his eyes. Lord Cassian said confirmation wasn't possible without compromising the operation. He said you'd been behaving unusually tonight, that your judgment regarding the Veil Woman might be... He stopped. Compromised. Yes. Lucien looked at his steward, at the man who had managed Thorncrown for 30 years, who had known him since he was 8 years old, who had watched him build everything this castle represented. Aldrich's face held something that looked like what grief looks like when it's been stripped of all sentimentality and only the structural damage remains. You believed him, Lucien said. For 3 hours I did. Aldrich's voice did not break. It came very close. I corrected that belief when I understood what had been sent through that entrance. I have spent the last 40 minutes trying to find a way to tell you. Lucien said nothing for a long moment. The lamp between them burned with a steadiness that seemed inappropriate to the room's content. This was the thing that power did not protect you from. He had built 12 years of absolute authority across Valamir's northern territories on the axiom that control was comprehensive, that if you managed every variable, eliminated every vulnerability, refused every attachment that could be leveraged against you, you became structurally untouchable. He had believed that axiom completely, had shaped himself entirely around it. What his brother had just demonstrated, with 3 men in a service door and 60 seconds of a trusted steward's misplaced belief, was that the architecture had a fault line he had built himself. That the one thing he had never categorized as a vulnerability was the one thing that had just been used against him. Family was not loyalty. Family was the longest-running bet you'd ever made on someone else's character, and the house did not always cover it. Right to Cassian, Lucien said. His voice had a quality in it that he recognized from the handful of times in his life that he had passed through something irrevocable. Flat, precise. The voice of a man who has just amputated something and is now focused entirely on stopping the bleeding. Tell him his men failed. Tell him I want to see him at Thorncrown within 5 days. A pause. Tell him nothing else. Yes, Your Grace. And Aldrich. He stopped at the door. You will not receive another communication from my brother without bringing it to me before you act on it. If that instruction conflicts with something he presents as my directive, you will assume the conflict is intentional and act accordingly. Yes. A pause. Your Grace. I know, Lucien said, and left it there, because there was no version of what came next that either of them needed to say aloud. He found Serafina in the corridor outside her room. She had not gone inside. She stood with her arms at her sides and her back straight, and that expression she wore when she was processing something she hadn't predicted. And she looked at him when he came up the stairs and read his face with the accuracy he had stopped being surprised by. What happened? She said. He told her, concisely, without softening the edges. Cassian's name, Aldrich's role, the specific cold geometry of how it had been constructed. He watched her absorb it and do what she always did, take the new information and route it into the existing structure rather than letting it dismantle the structure. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Your brother, she said. He's connected to Brennan, or he is Brennan's leverage inside House Dargoven, which is a different and worse thing. She looked at him. You didn't know? No. Something shifted in her expression. Not pity. She did not have the instinct for pity in the way most people did, but something adjacent to recognition. The expression of a person who has lived inside the specific wound of being betrayed by someone you believed was structurally yours. Then we have the same problem, she said. Lucien looked at her, at the corridor around them. His corridor, his castle, the stone his family had built, and the name that was supposed to make him untouchable. At the woman who had arrived 12 hours ago with her father's 4 years of documentation and her own 4 years of calculated endurance, who had burned her only protection on his word, who was now standing in the ruins of both their plans with her back straight and her eyes level. Brennan moves first or Cassian does, he said. One of them will, now that tonight failed. We have days, perhaps less. Then we need to move faster than both of them. That requires resources I cannot access through the council, while Brennan holds 3 votes and Cassian is an unknown variable inside my own house. She held his gaze. There is another way. A pause. Very brief. The pause of someone releasing a card they had been holding for a very long time. My father had a contact, a man in the capital with direct access to the king's private correspondence secretary, someone who was not on the council, not connected to Brennan's network, and who owed my father a debt that outlived him. She looked at him steadily. I have never used that contact because using it meant exposing myself completely to someone I couldn't fully vet. It meant stepping outside every protection I'd built. Another pause. It was the last option I was saving. Saving for what? For the moment when every other option was gone, her voice was absolutely level. That moment appears to be now. Lucien looked at her. At the cost in her face of saying that, not regret, but the specific expression of someone who has just spent their last reserve and is standing in the full awareness of what that means. Outside Thorncrown's walls, the winter pressed down on Valamir with the particular weight of a season that did not negotiate. Inside, the castle that had been built to be impregnable had just demonstrated the one thing impregnable structures always eventually demonstrated, that every fortress, given sufficient time and sufficient intimacy, produces its own betrayal from within. Lucien d'Argovin had spent 12 years building a version of himself that did not need anything from anyone. That version had just been rendered insufficient by a woman with dark eyes and no remaining options, and by a brother whose motives he had not examined because examining them would have required admitting they existed. He could hold the line he had always held. Move alone, move cold, move with the comprehensive control that had defined every choice he'd made since he was 20. Trust nothing that could be used against him, including her, including the contact she was offering, including the first working alliance he had been presented with in 12 years that was not built on fear. Or he could step into the geometry she was describing, which meant stepping into exposure, which meant becoming, in some structural sense he could feel but not yet name, a different version of the man who had looked down from the North Tower 8 hours ago and believed he could see everything that mattered. "Give me the contact's name," he said, and crossed the line that had no other side. The contact's name was Halvard. That was all Serafina gave him that night. A name and a city, the capital, Valamir's seat, 4 days south by Hard Road. She gave it the way you give someone the last coin in your pocket, completely, without pretending you have more. Lucien took it the same way he'd taken everything she'd offered, with the specific attention of a man who understands that some currencies only spend once. He sent the letter before dawn. His own hand, his own cipher, routed through a courier he trusted precisely because the man had no political investments and charged purely by the mile. Then he slept 3 hours, which was what his body required and what the next 5 days would allow. When he came down in the morning, Serafina was already in the library. She had found the eastern alcove where the territorial maps were kept, and had 3 of them spread across the reading table with the focused attention of someone who had moved past last night's damage and arrived at the next problem. Mira sat nearby with a ledger, copying something in a small, precise hand. Neither of them looked like women who had been cornered by armed men 8 hours ago. They looked like women who had incorporated that experience into their existing understanding of the world, and continued. Lucien stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them registered him. He was aware, in the way of a man performing an honest inventory, that he was choosing to stay in the doorway rather than announce himself, that he was watching her without the tactical purpose that had justified watching her last night, that the quality of his attention had shifted somewhere in the dark hours, and he was not yet decided about what to do with that. She looked up. "The Crestmere Eastern Valley," she said without preamble. "The mineral survey records that documented the rights. There should be a secondary copy in the territorial archive at Valamir Capital. If we can access that before Brennan realizes what we're moving toward. Brennan's man in the archive is a registrar named Fold," Lucien said, coming into the room. "He's been there 11 years. He flags any request touching Eastern Crestmere holdings within hours." He moved to the table. "We can't go through the archive directly. Then through Halvard. If he responds." "He'll respond." She said it without the texture of hope, as pure assessment. "My father saved his position once during the West Hall inquiry. Halvard is a man who pays his debts. It's the quality my father most trusted in him." Lucien looked at the map she'd been studying, at the valley in question, a stretch of land that had appeared unremarkable on every survey record he'd ever seen, deliberately so, rendered ordinary by 11 years of careful misdirection. The kind of misdirection that required multiple participants and continuous maintenance. The kind that somebody had decided was worth a man's life to protect. He thought about Cassian. He had been thinking about Cassian in the way you think about a wound. Not constantly, but with a recurring awareness that it was there, that it required attention, that ignoring it would not make it less serious. His brother had sent 3 men into Thorncrown, had used Aldrich, had known Serafina would be here, which meant either Brennan had told him or he'd been watching the same patterns Brennan was watching, which meant he was either an instrument or a partner. The distinction mattered for tactics. For everything else, for the thing that had no clean name, it didn't matter at all. Cassian had not responded to the letter. 4 days. Silence. The response from Halvard came on the 5th day, not to Thorncrown but to a merchant contact in the nearest city, routed through 3 hands in a way that told Lucien the man was serious and frightened in equal measure. The message was brief. He had the secondary survey records. He would not send them. He would deliver them personally, in the capital, to Lucien's hand, in exchange for a guarantee of protection that he was asking Lucien to understand he would not otherwise survive providing. He knows what they mean, Serafina said, reading the message once and handing it back. He's known for some time, probably. Lucien folded the paper. He's been waiting for someone with enough standing to make the risk survivable. So we go to the capital. I go to the capital. He held up a hand before she could respond. Brennan's people failed here. They will not make the same approach twice. They'll move to intercept in transit or in the city, where the variables favor them. If you're with me, you're a visible target. If I'm here, I'm alone in a castle where someone already used my host steward against me, and where your brother hasn't answered a letter in 5 days. Her voice was completely level. That's not a safer geometry, Your Grace. That's a different set of risks with no one to run them but me. He looked at her. She looked back with the expression that he had stopped trying to categorize, because every category he had available was insufficient. We go together, she said. We present a unified position to Halvard, and we bring the records back through your network rather than mine. That's the structure that makes sense. A pause. You know it is. He did know it. He had known it before she said it, which was becoming a pattern he found both useful and deeply inconvenient. 2 days to prepare, he said. We leave at dawn on the 3rd day. They left at dawn on the 3rd day. The road to Valamir's capital cut south through the hill country, 4 days in the best weather, longer in winter conditions that had settled into the particular gray persistence of the season's hardest month. Lucien traveled with 6 of his own men, not a retinue, nothing that announced itself, dressed in plain wool and spread across 2 unremarkable coaches. Serafina rode in the second with Mira. He rode in the first with Garrett, whose temple had healed to a yellow bruise that he appeared to regard as a professional embarrassment. The first 2 days passed without incident, which Lucien did not trust. The attack came on the morning of the 3rd day, 12 miles from the capital, at a narrow valley pass where the road compressed between rock faces and the winter light arrived at angles that cut visibility to 40 feet on either side. He heard the horses before he saw them. Not hoofbeats on the road, hoofbeats on the stone above, which told him someone had positioned riders on the ridge before dawn and had been waiting. His body made the calculation before his mind finished forming it, and he was out of the coach before it stopped moving, his voice already carrying the sequence of orders that his men had trained for. What followed was not a battle in the dramatic sense. It was the specific, ugly chaos of an ambush by competent professionals against a convoy that had been expecting something and had not been expecting it quite like this. 8 riders came off the ridge. 2 of Lucien's outriders went down in the first exchange. The coaches stopped on uneven ground and the horses screamed, and somewhere in the noise Lucien was moving through it with the cold clarity that danger had always produced in him. Not courage, nothing as romantic as courage, simply the narrowing of the world to its immediate geometry and the body acting on what it knew. He took a blade across the left forearm in the 2nd minute, felt it as pressure first, then heat, then the specific wrongness of damage. Filed it. Kept moving. The fight lasted perhaps 6 minutes. Afterward, 4 of the attackers were down. 2 had run. 2 of Lucien's men were injured, 1 seriously. The road was very quiet in the way that follows violence, a silence that has a different density than ordinary silence, heavier, like air after a storm. He went to the 2nd coach. Serafina was there. She had a bruise rising along her jaw where she'd been thrown against the doorframe when the coach stopped hard, and she was holding a small blade she had apparently produced from somewhere on her person. And when she saw him, she looked directly at his arm and said, "That needs to be wrapped now." "I'm aware." "Mira." She did not look away from him. "The medical kit, the larger one." He sat on the coach step and let Mira work on the arm with the specific tolerance of a man who has been wounded before and understands that the process is non-negotiable. Serafina stood in front of him, not hovering but present, watching his face with that reading expression. "Brennan moved faster than we planned for," she said. "He has someone watching the northern roads, someone we didn't account for." He kept his eyes on the valley above. 2 of his men were moving through the rock faces, checking the positions the attackers had used. He knew our route. Cassian, the name sat between them. He had not said it. She had. "He's the only one who knew the timing," Lucien said, "outside this convoy." She was quiet for a moment. "How many people does Brennan have in the capital?" "Enough." He looked at her. You understand that when we reach Halvard, we have perhaps hours before Brennan's people know we're in the city. Whatever he has, we take it and we move directly to the king's correspondence secretary. No intermediary steps. The secretary will need... I know what he'll need. I'll provide it. He paused. I have certain things on the secretary himself that will encourage his efficiency. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite discomfort, but occupied the space between them. You keep leverage on the king's own staff. I keep leverage on everyone. A pause. It's kept me alive longer than affection has. She held his gaze for one moment. Until recently, she said. He said nothing, but he didn't look away. They reached the capital before dark. Halvard met them in a building near the Merchant District, a private records office, the kind of location that existed in every capital city, where people stored documents they needed to exist without appearing to exist. He was older than Lucien. Ian had expected, perhaps 70, with the hands of a man who had spent decades handling paper, and the eyes of someone who had spent that same time handling things the paper documented. He looked at Serafina when they entered, and something moved through his face. Recognition, grief, a complicated settling. You look like him, he said. Your father. I know, she said. He gave them the records without ceremony. 2 bound folios, 11 years of mineral survey documentation that had been carefully duplicated in the official records as agricultural assessments, the substitution so precise and consistently maintained that it would have required Crown Council authorization to execute. 3 names on the authorization: Brennan, Edris, and a third name that made the room very quiet for a moment: Lord Caverley, who had not attended the Winter Sovereign Ball, who had received Lucien's carefully ambiguous letter 11 days ago and had not responded, who sat on the King's Revenue Oversight Body and had been, for 11 years, the man who certified the agricultural assessments that concealed the mineral records. Serafina looked at the name without expression for a long moment. 3 votes on the council, she said quietly. Brennan, Edris, Caverley. Not Harwick. Harwick was a tool, someone they used for minor operations and kept away from the core. Lucien looked at the documents. They didn't trust Harwick with the real architecture, which means the documents he could have produced would have pointed at the structure but not exposed it completely. My father didn't know about Caverley. Nobody did. That's the point of Caverley. He looked at Halvard. The correspondence secretary. Arnett, he's in the palace complex. He was, Halvard said carefully. Lord Arnett retired 6 months ago. A pause. His replacement is a man named So. I don't know him. I can't tell you where his interests lie. The information landed with the specific weight of a variable that changes the entire calculation. Arnett had been the connection. Arnett who owed Halvard a debt, who had been the agreed-upon endpoint of this entire operation. His replacement was an unknown who might be clean, might be Brennan's, might be something else entirely. And they had hours before Brennan's network in the capital identified their location. Lucien stood in the records office with the documents in his hand and ran the geometry at speed. Without Arnett, direct access to the king required going through formal council channels, which Brennan controlled. Going around the council required the king's private audience process, which was managed by the secretary, who was unknown. Going above all of it required the kind of direct action that would be characterized as an assault on council authority, regardless of what the document showed, which gave Brennan the grounds to move against Thorncrown before the evidence could be heard. Every route that had existed that morning had just closed. Every route except one. He looked at Serafina. She was already looking at him with the expression of a woman who had run the same calculation and arrived at the same remainder. There's a council session in 3 days, she said. Full attendance required, the winter governance review. A pause. If you presented the documents directly to the full council, in session, in front of every lord with voting rights, Brennan would move to have them dismissed as fraudulent. He has 3 votes. He controls the session record, not if someone else controls the room before he can move. She held his gaze. Not if the presentation is made in a way that forces every lord present to choose a visible position, publicly, before Brennan's people can manage the narrative. Another pause. Not if the presentation comes from you, as Duke of the Northern Territories, in your formal capacity, making a charge of conspiracy against sitting council members. That would expose every piece of evidence I have, including the source. He looked at her steadily. Including you. Publicly. Before a full council. Yes. Brennan would come after you with everything available to him. He's already coming after me. She said it with the flat simplicity of someone describing weather. At least this way he has to do it in front of witnesses. Lucienne looked at this woman, at the 4 years she was carrying in the set of her jaw, at the calculation she had just made that placed herself directly in the center of the most exposed position available, because it was the one move that the geometry required, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. He thought about the 6 minutes on the road that morning, about the blade on his arm that Mira had wrapped with competent hands while Serafina watched his face, about the specific, irrational, structurally indefensible shift that had happened in him somewhere between the North Tower and this records office, that had nothing to do with leverage and everything to do with something he had spent 12 years building a life around not having. He thought about what it would cost her to stand in a council chamber in front of every lord of consequence in Valamir and be the visible evidence in a case that 3 powerful men had already killed to suppress. "There's another way to protect you in that room," he said. She waited. "If you're attached to House Dargovan formally," he said. His voice had a quality he did not fully recognize. The specific flatness of a man saying something he means completely and finds no comfortable language for. "If you're not a private citizen with a grievance but a member of a ducal house bringing charges. The standing is different. The protection is different." She looked at him. "You're talking about marriage," she said. "I'm talking about survival geometry." But something in his face, he was aware, was not keeping pace with the clinical framing. She was quiet for a long moment. Halvard had gone to the window with the discretion of a man who has handled enough sensitive information to understand when to become architecturally invisible. "That's a considerable thing to use as a tactical maneuver," she said. "Yes." "And after? After is after." He held her gaze. "The immediate problem is 3 days." She looked at him for a long time with the expression he had never successfully categorized. Then she looked at the documents in his hand. At 11 years of her father's evidence that had cost him everything and had almost cost her the same. At the room around them and the city outside and the council session 3 days away, and the man standing in front of her who had burned her documents, ridden into an ambush without hesitation, and was now proposing marriage with the specific emotional temperature of a man diffusing an explosive device. "All right," she said. Outside in the capital's winter streets, Lucien's remaining men were positioned at the building's exits. Somewhere in the city, Brennan's network was moving. Cassian had not answered a single letter. The council session was 72 hours away, and every variable in the approach had just been rewritten by one retired secretary. Lucien looked at the documents, at the woman who had just said all right to something that would change the shape of both their lives, with the same directness she'd used for everything since the moment she'd looked at him across a winter fireplace without fear. He thought, the moment a man discovers what he's actually protecting is not the moment he becomes strong. It is the moment he becomes dangerous in a way that has no ceiling. He put the documents inside his coat, and then the door came off its hinges. 4 men. Lucien registered them in the half-second of the door's movement. Not Brennan's operatives from the road, different men, better equipped, moving with the coordinated precision of a unit that had been trained rather than hired. Behind them, stepping through the destroyed frame, with the unhurried ease of someone who had scripted this moment, was a man Lucien had last seen 3 years ago at a trade negotiation in the Southern Territories. Cassian Dargovan looked at his brother across the ruined door and the scattered papers and the woman standing at the table. He looked like Lucien the way a copy looks like an original. Similar enough to register, different enough to see the difference once you knew what to look for. Same height, lighter build, the same dark eyes, but without the specific quality that Lucien's held. He was 31 years old, and he was smiling in a way that did not reach anything above his mouth. "You always were better at finding things than keeping them," Cassian said. Lucien held his brother's gaze across the room. His arm burned where the blade had gone in that morning. His 4 remaining men were outside, and the building had 2 exits, and both of them now had Cassian's people at them, a fact that Cassian's posture communicated without stating. The documents were inside his coat. Serafina was 4 feet to his left, and not moving and not looking at the door. She was looking at him with that reading expression, waiting. Cassian's eyes moved to her, then back. Lord Brennan sends his regards, Cassian said, and I have a counterproposal for this theatrical council presentation you've been planning. He took one step forward into the room. Give me what's in your coat. Walk away from this woman and this city. Return to Thorncrown and govern your northern territories and never come south of the hill, pass again. Another step. And I will guarantee that Seraphina Vale reaches the border alive. The room held the specific quality of the moment before something irreversible. Lucien looked at his brother, at the man he had shared a childhood with, who had learned the same lessons from the same harsh architecture, who had apparently drawn the opposite conclusion from all of it, that the thing to do with a powerful man's blind spot was not to protect it, but to put a knife in it. He felt the documents against his chest. He felt Seraphina 4 feet to his left. He felt, with the absolute clarity of a man who has arrived at the thing he has been unknowingly moving toward his entire life, exactly what he was going to do next. And Cassian read it in his face, read it the way only a brother could, the way only someone who had studied the same face for 30 years could, and his smile finally reached his eyes, cold and ready. Make the choice, Lucien, he said. Lucien moved left, not toward the door, not toward Cassian, not toward the tactical exit that a man running pure survival calculation would have taken. He moved left, which put his body between Seraphina and the 4 men in the room, and he felt rather than heard the specific shift in Cassian's breathing that meant his brother had not predicted that. Good. Unpredictability was the only weapon he had in the next 10 seconds. The documents, Cassian said, and the patience in his voice had an edge under it now. You came yourself, Lucien said. He kept his voice at the register he used for negotiations, not low, not loud, the register that required the other person to be still to hear it. Not Brennan's men, not a message. You. He looked at his brother across the room. You came because you needed to see it, whether I'd actually do it. Something moved in Cassian's face. Give me the documents, Lucien. What did he offer you? Not accusation, genuine inquiry. The specific question of a man who needs to understand the mathematics before he can address them. The council seat. It's the council seat. Cassian's jaw tightened. Brennan promised me the Northern Territories seat when you're removed. Yes. No hesitation, and the lack of hesitation was its own kind of answer. The answer of a man who has been holding something so long that putting it down feels like relief. You've held that seat for 12 years, and you hold it like it's the world's entire weight, and you never once considered what it costs the people around you to orbit something that large. It cost them appropriately, Lucien said. It cost me everything. The smile was entirely gone now. What remained was something raw, not hatred, something that lived on the far side of hatred, the specific damage of a person who loved something they couldn't reach. You have no idea what it is to be your brother. To be the man standing 6 inches outside the border of every room you walk into, watching every door open for you that stays shut for everyone else. His voice held the flat, careful quality of an old wound that has been pressed on enough times that the pain is no longer sharp, just structural. I stopped waiting for you to notice 8 years ago. Brennan noticed. Brennan offered. The room held the specific silence of something that could not be unsaid. Lucien looked at his brother. At 31 years of a face he had known since it was an infant's, had grown up alongside, had taught things to and been taught things by, and then somewhere in the process of becoming what power required him to become, had simply stopped seeing, had categorized as managed, as stable, as one of the variables that did not require ongoing attention because it had never presented as a problem. He thought about the portraits in Thorncrown's staircase, about 12 generations of men who had built the same architecture of impregnable isolation and called it strength and passed it down like heirloom furniture, each generation receiving it and reinforcing it and handing it forward without ever asking what it was actually costing. He had received it. He had reinforced it. He had been passing it forward in every room he'd ever walked into, including this one. Cassian, he said. His brother's eyes had the specific quality of a man braced for something. The seat is yours, Lucien said. When this is done, I'll put it in writing. The room went very still. Cassian stared at him. That's not a negotiating position? No. Lucien held his brother's gaze with the full weight of 12 years of absolute authority, but without the cold that had always accompanied it. Just the weight, stripped of the wall. It's what should have been offered 8 years ago, when I was too occupied building a version of myself that didn't need anything to notice what I was taking from you. A pause. I can't give you the 8 years. I can give you the seat. One of Cassian's men shifted. Cassian made a small gesture with one hand that stopped the movement, and Lucian noticed the gesture. Noticed that the men deferred to Cassian, not to Brennan's instructions in the abstract, which meant Cassian had operational control of this unit, which meant Cassian was further into this arrangement than a seat had purchased. Brennan won't let this dissolve, Cassian said. His voice had changed, not soft, but uncertain in a way it hadn't been 30 seconds ago, the specific uncertainty of a man whose prepared script has been departed from. He has the council, he has the capital network, he has 3 votes, and a secretary who retired 6 months ago, and a mineral rights fraud that is now documented in 2 separate locations by 2 separate people. Lucian reached into his coat, took out the documents, held them where Cassian could see them. Help me get these in front of the king's chamber in the next 48 hours. That's all I'm asking. And when Brennan falls, you take the seat he was going to give you, but you take it on ground that isn't poisoned by what he built it on. Cassian looked at the documents, at Serafina, at his brother. The 4 men in the room were very still in the way of professionals waiting for direction. Something happened in Cassian's face that Lucian had not seen there in... He searched and found the honest answer. Not since their father's funeral 20 years ago, when they had stood at the grave in the Thorncrown yard and Cassian had been 11 years old and had reached for Lucian's hand and Lucian had given it without thinking, and then spent the next 2 decades building a structure that had no room for that gesture. If Brennan survives this, Cassian said quietly, he will destroy everything you've built. Then help me make sure he doesn't survive it. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Cassian looked at his men and said, Stand down. But what followed was not elegant. The next 48 hours were the specific grinding work of an operation running on compressed time with variables that kept redrawing themselves. Cassian's network in the capital was more extensive than Lucien had known, which cut both ways, and Halvard proved to have connections in the king's administrative body that he had been strategically modest about. And Garrett, with his healing temple bruise and his professional fury, coordinated 3 separate information deliveries through channels that Brennan's people were not watching because Brennan had not considered them worth watching. Serafina spent those 48 hours in motion. She wrote 4 letters in her own hand, careful, precise documents addressed to 4 lords who had no love for Brennan and sufficient standing to force a council session outside the normal calendar, which was the critical structural move that prevented Brennan from managing the timing. She sent Mira with 2 of the letters personally, which Lucian objected to on security grounds, and which Serafina overruled with the specific authority of a woman who had been running this operation longer than anyone else in the room. He watched her work and understood, with the cold clarity of a man performing an honest inventory, that the thing he had built his life around, the absolute sufficiency of solitary control, was not strength. It had been the shape of his grief, the form that 12 years of refusing to be the 11-year-old at the graveside had taken. Functional, yes. Effective, yes. And as complete a self-deception as anything Brennan had constructed in 11 years of falsified mineral surveys. He did not say this aloud. Some understanding arrives as action rather than declaration. On the morning of the 2nd day, he stood beside her at the window of the safe house, and she was reading Halvard's final notation, and he put his hand next to hers on the table. Not touching, just present, in the way of a man who has decided to stop managing the distance. And she looked at his hand and then at him with an expression that required no translation. The session is in 6 hours, she said. Yes. Brennan will try to have us removed before we reach the floor. He'll try. Lucian looked at the window, at the capital outside in its winter gray. Cassian's men are at the 4 entry points. Halvard's contact has confirmed the chamber steward, and Lord Caverley, a pause, received a very specific letter this morning that made clear his choices and their respective costs. She looked at him. Caverley will break. Caverley is a man who has spent 11 years being careful. Careful men, when the structure that made their caution profitable collapses, tend to run toward whoever can offer them the new structure fastest. He looked at her. I sent the letter before dawn. You offered him protection. I offered him the opportunity to be the man who came forward rather than the man who was exposed. Those are very different positions to occupy in the historical record. She was quiet for a moment. Your father taught you that. My father taught me the cold version of it. He looked at the table. I'm trying the version that leaves a door open. She looked at him for a long moment with that expression that had no name he'd found adequate. Then she picked up the documents and squared them against the table with a precise final motion. Let's go end this, she said. The council chamber was not built for drama. It was built for governance. Stone walls, long tables, the portrait of the reigning king above the central dais, windows that let in northern light at a flat and unforgiving angle. 47 lords of Valamir took their seats for the emergency session with the expressions of men who had been told this was irregular and had arrived to determine what irregular meant in practice. Brennan was there. He had not expected to be outmaneuvered on the session's convening, and the specific quality of his composure, too controlled, the composure of a man applying it as a correction rather than wearing it naturally, told Lucien that Brennan understood something had shifted, but not yet the full dimensions of how far. Edris was there. He sat 3 seats from Brennan and looked at nothing and everyone with the specific neutrality of a man who had been running a long deception and could feel it coming apart at the seams and was deciding, in real time, which way to move. Caverly was not there. Caverly had sent a sealed letter to the chamber steward that morning, delivered by his own man, which the steward read aloud at the session's opening with the specific flatness of a professional reader delivering something extraordinary, with no editorializing. The letter was 5 paragraphs. It documented, in Caverly's own hand, 11 years of his involvement in the mineral rights fraud, his role in the suppression of Lord Aldisvale's inquiry, and his understanding that the authorization records had been preserved and would be presented to the full council by the Duke of the Northern Territories. The chamber was very quiet after the reading. Brennan stood. He was good at recovery. 30 years of council work had given him a specific talent for retaking a room. This letter is an obvious forgery produced by Lord Brennan. Lucian's voice filled the chamber the way Thorncrown's corridors had always filled with it. Not volume, weight. Sit down. The specific shock of being addressed that way in a council chamber in front of 47 witnesses by a man whose standing and documented evidence were now both on the table did what Lucien had calculated it would do. Brennan sat. Not because he chose to, because the room's gravity had shifted, and standing against it required a resource he no longer had. Lucien placed the documents on the dais table. He spoke for 23 minutes. He did not perform. He did not editorialize. He presented the architecture of 11 years of fraud the way he'd presented everything in his life, with the precision of a man who understood that the facts, correctly organized, required no decoration. Survey records, authorization signatures, the Vale correspondence, Halvard's testimony, presented in written form with Halvard's seal, Cassian's account of the operational network, delivered through Lucian's own statement with Cassian's signed confirmation attached. Seraphina sat in the witness chair to the right of the dais. She was asked twice to speak and spoke twice, concisely, directly, without ornamentation, with the voice of a woman who had been waiting 4 years for a room that would hear her and was not going to waste it. Edris broke on the 14th minute. Not dramatically. He simply raised his hand, which was the council's formal gesture for wishing to make a statement, and when acknowledged said 11 words. I want to confirm the accuracy of what's been presented regarding my involvement. The chamber did what chambers do when the structure of a long-maintained fiction collapses. Noise, motion, the specific sound of 47 men recalibrating simultaneously. Brennan looked at Lucien across the chamber floor with an expression that had nothing diplomatic left in it. Just the raw face of a man who has run a long game and watched it end. You've destroyed years of work, Brennan said. Quietly, almost privately, as though the chamber had emptied. For what? A woman with a grievance and a dead father. Lucien looked at him. For Valamir. And yes, for her. He had not planned to say the second part. It came out with the specific quality of something that had been true for some time and had simply, in this room, run out of reasons to be managed. Brennan was removed from the chamber by the King's Guard 40 minutes later. Edris followed. The session lasted 3 more hours and accomplished the administrative transfer of the mineral rights designation, the restoration of Cressmere's property title to House Vale, and a formal inquiry into the death of Lord Aldous Vale, which would take 6 months to complete and would produce findings that Lucien already knew the shape of. He He sat through all of it. So did Serafina. At one point, in the fourth hour, she put her hand on the table beside his. Not touching, just present. He looked at it, and then moved his hand an inch, and let their fingers meet at the edges, and neither of them looked at the other, and the session continued around them. Well, they were married 3 weeks later. Not the forced declaration from the original plan. That plan had belonged to a version of him that no longer quite fit. This was quieter. A formal ceremony in Thorncrown's main hall with 40 witnesses, including Cassian, who stood at the edge of the gathering with an expression that held, for the first time in memory, something that resembled peace. Lucien had given him the Northern Council seat, in writing, as promised. Cassian had received it with 2 words, "Thank you," which was more than Lucien had expected and exactly what he'd needed to hear, and neither of them said anything else about it, because some debts are acknowledged rather than settled, and both of them knew the difference. The hall was cold, the way Thorncrown was always cold in winter, and Serafina stood beside him in dark blue again. She had not performed anything different for the occasion than she performed on any other day, which he had expected and found, in the finding, that it was the right choice for both of them. She said her formal words with the same directness she'd used for everything since the night they'd stood at the fireplace, and she'd looked at him without fear. He said his. There was a moment, very brief, when the ceremony was concluded and the room produced the appropriate sounds of acknowledgement, and she looked at him. Just looked. The way she had looked at his grandfather's portrait the first night, the way she had looked at him across the map room with the fire dying, the way she had looked at him in the council chamber when he'd said for her without planning to, and he understood that the quality he had spent the last month trying to name was simply this. She saw him. Not the architecture, not the authority, not the carefully constructed absence of need. The man inside the structure, with all the damage the structure had been built to hide. She saw it, and she was still there. He had built 12 years of a life on the premise that being seen was the same as being vulnerable. He stood in Thorncrown's cold hall and felt the premise fail, and found, in its failing, that what remained was not the wound he had expected. What remained was simply himself, intact. Finally, after a very long time, without the wall. The winter passed. Aldous Vale's inquiry produced its findings in the spring. The formal determination was what Serafina had known for 4 years and had carried alone and had nearly destroyed herself to prove. She read it in the library, the same eastern alcove with the maps, the same morning light, and Lucien sat across from her and did not speak and did not leave. And when she finished reading, she set it down and looked out the window for a long time and then said, "He was right. He was just right too early." "Yes," Lucien said. "That's what killed him. Not the evidence. The timing." "Yes." She looked at him. "I want Cressmere rebuilt, not restored. Rebuilt. Different. Something he would have recognized as better than what he had." "I know," he said. "I've already spoken to the surveyors." She looked at him with an expression that was not surprise. She had stopped being surprised by him the way he had stopped being surprised by her, which was the specific intimacy of 2 people who have paid close enough attention to each other that the other person's choices begin to feel inevitable. "When?" 6 weeks ago. He paused. "I was going to tell you when the plans were ready, so you could change them." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the window again, and he watched the thing that passed through her face. Grief and something that was not happiness exactly, but was its surviving relative. The emotion that exists on the far side of grief when you've carried it long enough that it stops being weight and becomes simply part of the way you stand. "Lucien," she said. "Yes." "Thank you." A pause. "For burning the documents." He looked at her. "They were a liability. They were my father." Her voice was level. "And you understood that even then, which is why you memorized them first." She looked at him with the reading expression, but softer now. Still precise, but without the armor the precision had always worn. "You've never been as cold as you needed people to believe." He said nothing for a moment. "Don't tell anyone," he said finally. She looked at him, and the thing that crossed her face was something he had not seen from her before. Brief, unguarded, the specific expression of a person surprised by the exact right thing at the exact right time. Not quite a smile. Something better than a smile. something that did not perform itself. "I'll take it to my grave," she said. Late in the autumn, after Kresimir's new construction had begun and the council inquiry had completed, and Valimir had settled into the specific, cautious equilibrium of a power structure after it has been cracked open and rebuilt, Lucien went to the castle garden in the early morning. It was a thing he had started doing without deciding to. The north garden, where the winter roses grew in the protected corners between the old stone walls, where the frost came late because the walls held heat. He had no particular purpose there. He walked among the dormant thorns and the last of the autumn color, and he thought about things he had previously not permitted himself the time to think about, which was simply what it was to be here, in this place, with the weight of everything he'd built and the weight of everything it had cost, and the specific, improbable fact that both of those things were survivable. Power, he had believed for 12 years, was the answer to the question of how to live. The comprehensive answer. The one that covered every other question if you built it large enough and maintained it relentlessly enough. What he understood now, not abstractly, not philosophically, but in the cellular, specific way that a man understands something he has earned rather than been told, was that power was a question, not an answer. That every structure you built to protect yourself from loss was also a structure that kept you from holding what you were protecting. That the impregnable man was the empty man, and the empty man was not the strong one. He was simply the one who had found a way to stop noticing the hunger. He had built Thorncrown into a fortress, and lived inside it as though that was the same as being safe. Serafina had walked in with the wrong knock and the right look and no fear, and had simply refused to treat the fortress as a fact. And he had burned her documents and offered her his name, and stood in a council chamber and said for her without planning to, and discovered that none of it, not a single move, had destroyed him. That the wall had been the cost, not the protection. That what was on the other side of it was not vulnerability, but the only version of himself that was actually real. He heard her step on the garden path before she reached him. She came to stand beside him among the winter roses with a shawl around her shoulders, and her dark hair loose, and the expression of someone who has also just come from something quiet and interior. She looked at the thorns. He looked at her. "I had a letter from Cassian," she said. "The Eastern water rights negotiation. He says it's progressing." A pause. "He says to tell you he's learning the patience." Something moved through Lucien's chest. He looked at the roses. "Tell him it took me 36 years. She looked at him, and the morning light was flat and honest, and she was exactly what she had been the first night, direct, unperformed, carrying everything she carried without apology for the weight of it. He had looked at her from a tower window and read her in 4 seconds and understood nothing. He had burned her documents and thought he was protecting an asset. He had said for her in a council chamber and known, in the saying, that something had been true for longer than he'd admitted. He put his arm around her, which was a gesture he had not made with another person, and he searched and could not find an honest answer. A long time. She leaned into it with the specific ease of someone who has stopped performing distance, and found that what's underneath it is simply warmth. They stood in the garden with the winter roses and the early light, and the castle at their backs. Thorncrown was still cold. It would always be cold. It was built for that, built for endurance and weight, and the long holding of difficult ground. But in the garden, where the walls caught the heat, the cold had an edge off it, enough to stand in without armor. That was all. Not warm, never warm in the way of easy things, just enough. For the first time in his life, enough was sufficient.